Winter is coming, and it's good to be cozy. We're going to make a scarf today using an Ashford Handicrafts Limited 32-inch rigid Heddle loom. This is a starter weaving project, so just follow along. And don't worry if you can't find the exact material we're using. In fact, you really should choose some yarn you like and just make this project your own. Before we start, let's talk about some weaving terminology. The warp is the set of threads that runs lengthways on the loom. The weft is the set of threads that runs across the warp. For the warp, I'm going to use Juniper Moon Farm Cumulus yarn in color 49 Atlantis. This is a velvety soft blend of brushed Israeli Mako cotton and a touch of nylon for strength. It's ideal for all-season garments and accessories as it's light, airy and cozy. The color 49 Atlantis is a beautiful shade of blue-green that resembles the ocean or the sky. It has a subtle variation in hue that creates a dappled effect on the fabric. This yarn is perfect for creating a scarf that is soft, smooth and soothing. For the weft, I'm using Malabrigo Caracol yarn 416 Indicita. This is a bulky, thick and thin single-ply yarn that is truly one of a kind. This superwash merino wool is crisscrossed with binder thread and then hand-dyed in Malabrigo's signature kettle-dyed colorways. It's very cozy, very warm. It's quite bulky. The wool yarn is thick and fluffy, and it has a black or white binder thread that adds some contrast and texture to the weft. The weft is the yarn that we weave across the warp. The way that we arrange the warp and the weft determines the pattern and the appearance of the fabric. The cotton yarn is relatively thin, so there's going to be a nice contrast in the weave. The Malabrigo Caracol yarn has a lot of variation in the color of the yarn, which will create a rich and dynamic effect in the fabric. Since we're planning to do a plain weave in this project, this will add a lot of interest to the weave. Okay, let's take a look at our loom. The Ashford Handicrafts Limited 32-inch rigid Heddle loom is a simple and versatile loom that's easy to use and assemble. It has a rigid heddle that acts as both a reed and a shaft, allowing us to create different types of weave with one heddle. It also has a built-in second heddle option for more complex patterns and an indirect warping option for faster warping. Warping's actually kind of difficult, and it's one of the things that puts a lot of people off of weaving. So the fact that this loom is easy to warp is a huge win if you're learning how to weave. So let's take a look at some of the tools that we need. We'll need some tools to help with this project. Most of the specialized tools come with your loom. The others are common household items, so let's look at each in turn. This is a heddle or a reed. It's a frame that holds the warp threads in place and determines the spacing between them. It also helps us to beat the weft threads into place, creating a tight and even fabric. The reed has large holes and slots to accommodate a large variety of yarns. The warp threads pass through the holes and slots. This is a 30-10 reed that comes with the loom, and it sets the threads at 30 threads to each 10 centimeter section of reed, or 7.5 threads to an inch. This is called the set, or ends per inch, and it affects the density and the drape of the fabric. For this scarf, we want a loose set that allows the wool yarn to bloom and fill the gaps. A warping peg and clamp is used for direct warping. The warping peg is a wooden peg that we'll use to measure and wind the warp yarns around. The clamp is used to attach the warping peg to a table or a stool at a distance that is slightly longer than the length of the scarf that we want to make. For this project, we want about 2 meters between the warping peg and the back warp stick of the loom. Direct warping is a simple and fast method of warping the loom, which involves threading the warp yarns through the reed and winding them around the warping peg in one step. A stick shuttle. This is a wooden stick that we'll use to hold and carry the weft yarn across the warp. Ideally, it should be approximately the width of the fabric that we're weaving, or slightly shorter. We'll wind some of our wool yarn around the stick shuttle before we start weaving, leaving some space at both ends for easy handling. A threading and reed hook. This is a metal hook or a plastic hook that helps us pull the yarn through the holes and slots in the reed. We use it for both warping and weaving. For warping, we use it to catch the yarn and pull a loop through the slot. We use cardboard warp separators, and these are cardboard strips that we insert between the layers of warp as we wind them onto the back roller. They help us separate the threads and keep the tension even. They also prevent the threads from tangling or sticking together. You can cut your own cardboard warp separators from any cardboard box or use paper or fabric instead. I'm a big fan of using paper grocery bags, and what I do is I open them up and cut them into strips. Household items that we'll need are a pair of scissors. So we're going to need a good, sharp pair of sewing scissors for cutting yarn, but don't use them on paper or other materials. That'll keep them nice and sharp. You'll need the scissors to cut the yarn loops at the end of the warp, and also to trim fringes or tassels if you want to add them to your scarf. A tape measure. Most sewing tape measures are 1.6 meters long. If you have one that goes to 2 meters, that's useful but not essential. And so if you have a shorter tape measure, fabric tape measure, you can usually measure out 2 meters on a piece of string. And if you measure and cut a length of string, you get to this correct length. You'll need a tape measure to measure the distance between the warping peg and the back warp stick, which determines the length of your scarf. But you can also use it to check the width of your fabric as you weave and to measure the length of your fringes and tassels if you want to add them. I usually get a couple of skeins of yarn and roll them into balls, either at the yarn store or using a ball roller that I have myself. Whatever's left over can be used for other projects or to make a woolly hat to go with a scarf. You'll need 2 types of yarn for this project, one for the warp and one for the weft. A tapestry needle. A tapestry needle or a darning needle is useful for stitching the ends of the project to stop it unraveling. You can use a blanket stitch, and it doesn't have to be great. If you're not great at sewing, don't worry too much. You can also use it to weave in any loose ends or tails of yarn that might show in your fabric. A tapestry needle has a blunt tip and a large eye, which makes it easy to thread and pass through the fabric without splitting or snagging the yarn. Fringe twister. A fringe twister is not essential, but will make a nice finished look to tassels on the ends of your scarf. It's a tool that helps you twist 2 or more strands of yarn together to create a twisted fringe. You can also use your fingers or a pencil to twist the yarn, but a fringe twister will make it faster and more consistent. Loom stand. A loom stand is optional, but is worthwhile if you use your loom a lot, as it helps you to be much more comfortable while weaving. It's an accessory that holds the loom upright and allows you to adjust the height and angle of the loom. Ashford actually makes a series of really nice books with projects for their looms, and they're worth getting if you want to expand your weaving horizons. They've got really good tips in them, recipes for lots of different garments, and also how to do different types of weaving. And then if you look online, there's lessons on Ashford's website, and they also have a pamphlet that came with the loom. If you got your loom used, you can download a PDF of this from the Ashford website, and it's well worth going through as your first project. These will teach you how to set up, warp and weave and finish your projects on a rigid Heddle loom. This project's actually based on the starter book with a few tweaks based on experience making a couple of other scarves. We're going to use one reed for this project, the 3010 reed that comes with the loom. The reed is a frame that holds the warp threads in place and determines the spacing between them. It also helps us beat the weft threads into place, creating a tight and even fabric. We're going to use the front set of weaving positions since we are only using one reed. This will give us a plain weave, which is the simplest and most common type of weave. It creates a fabric that's flat and strong with a checkerboard pattern. Okay, let's look at setting up the project. The neat thing about the Ashford loom is that we can do the warping in situ. Normally I do this on a really big table, but today I thought I'd set this up in the garage with a stool so that you can see that you really don't need a lot of space or equipment to set up your weave. Here's a view of what my setup looks like. As you can see, I have my loom on an optional Ashford stand, which makes it easier to move around and adjust the height. You can also use loom clamps if you're using a table to set up the weave. What you want to do is clamp your loom to the table so that it doesn't move. Because even if it moves slightly, you're going to have a different tension on different parts of your warp, and that's going to be a problem when you weave. I have a stool here that's approximately the height of the loom at a distance that is a little bit more than the length of the scarf I want to make. I use sandbags on the stool, crossbars, and that helps to stop it wobbling around or moving. And I also put them on the loom stand to keep everything stable because I don't want the loom to move while I'm doing the warp. I clamp the warping peg to the stool. This is a wooden peg that we will use to measure and wind the warp yarns around. For this project, I want about 2 meters between the warping peg and the back warp stick of the loom. The back warp stick is a wooden stick that holds the warp yarns at the back of the loom. I've weighted both the stool with the warping peg and the loom stand to limit movement during the warping. For this project, there are 88 warp ends in the scarf. That means we need 88 individual strands of yarn that run from the back warp stick to the warping peg. However, we'll thread them in pairs, so we only need 44 loops of yarn. And don't worry if you lose count. You can always count how many doubled threads you've used using the teeth on the rigid heddle. To thread the warp yarns, we'll use a threading hook. Okay, so our loom's all set up. One of the things about this is that I want to use a little bowl. And the bowl's just going to hold my ball of wool. Okay. And then the plan here is basically, I'm going to center pull this. And that's not a center pull. Get the end that's in the middle of the ball. It should be this one, right? Yeah. Cool. So I'm just going to pull a bit out. And I'm going to put that on my end stick. Okay. So the steps for threading the loom are as follows. Tie one end of your cotton yarn to the back warp stick behind the first slot. Put the threading hook through the first slot, catch the yarn with the hook and pull a loop through the slot. Take one end of this loop over to your warping peg. Put both ends together and wind them around your warping peg. Return with both ends together back through the same slot. Tie these 2 ends together onto your back warp stick and then keep repeating until you've done the width of your scarf. Now, we mentioned earlier that this scarf is going to have 84 warp ends, and that means that we want 42 doubles. So what we're going to do is do big loops through the larger slots, and I want to count in on this particular loom with this particular heddle 39 slots in, and so I don't lose track, I actually mark that with a little piece of thread. So what I'm going to do is tie off on the end stick, and I'm going to start looping up to our end peg and back again. Okay, so you can see that I've tied off on my end stick. So what I'm going to do is get a bit of thread, and I want to come through the loop, the thing that I've marked. Okay, and to make this easier, what I'm going to do is put my threading hook through. Okay, I only have one set of hands unfortunately, so I'm going to put the threading hook through and just pull that through here. Okay, and then I'm basically going to come down to my peg and loop it over the peg. Okay, and that is our first one done. Okay, so the next step is I'm going to go underneath my stick this time, okay, and pull it through again. Do exactly the same thing. So let's get in here. And grab this guy, Okay, just get a little bit of slack on there, and then what I'm going to do is go through the next slot, and I'm just going to repeat that over and over again, over, under, on the end stick. So I'm going to do that, come back, and you can take a look. Okay, you can see we've got a few of these ends in now. Okay, we're almost done. It's time to move the ball again. Okay, so here's our warp, pretty much finished up. We have 42 pairs. You can double check. Now, things to check are that you don't miss a slot as you're doing this. When I first started weaving, I would frequently miss a slot. You have to be super careful. If you do miss a slot, it's no big deal. You just got to unwind it and put it back there. So try and keep an eye on that because it's no fun. And you'll see that with this yarn, it's quite a thin yarn, but we've used probably, I don't know, 2/3 of that ball. So that's cool. Waste yarn you can always do other projects with. So the last step here is to do exactly the same thing. I'm going to cut this and tie it back on. You want to try and make sure that you've got a relatively even texture, tension across here. You can do that by pulling things. Generally I try and keep the tension even as I'm warping. But yeah, pretty straightforward. So we'll just tie this end off, and then I'll show you how to wind on. So once we've threaded all the warp yarns, we need to wind them onto the loom. This will create tension and alignment in the warp, which will make weaving easier and smoother. Here are the steps for winding. Ask a friend to hold the warp ends for you, and move forward as you wind the warp onto the loom. You wind the back handle towards you until the back warp stick goes around the roller once. Insert a cardboard warp stick or piece of paper the full width of the back roller, and wind the back handle a little more than one full rotation. Insert another cardboard strip. This separates the threads and it keeps the tension even. Add more cardboard warp sticks or paper as you wind on the warp. Stop when the end of the warp reaches the front roller. Cut through the yarn loops. Don't wind any further. Okay, winding on is relatively straightforward, but you need a helper. So I found a helper, and also you're going to need our cardboard sticks. So the first thing to do is turn the ratchet on. Okay, and we'll start winding. And you want to wind this until basically, okay, did you take it over the end? Take it over the end of the peg and just hold it.
Like
okay.
Here?
Yeah, grab it in one bunch.
Like
okay.
this?
Yep. And then hold it in your hand, lift it up over the peg. There you go. All the way off. Okay, and then as I wind this, you want to keep the tension even. Okay, so I'm going to wind this around until that stick comes around one revolution. And then I'm going to start putting my cardboard sticks in. Okay, so I'm going to grab one of these and just put it in here. And this just helps to keep the threads separate. Okay, so get that in there. I need more hands. We'll wind that on. And then get another one in. It's much easier to use paper bags if you can, but apparently mine all went, so I'll be in the recycling. Okay, yeah, we'll just keep winding this on a couple times at a time. Get another stick in. This helps to keep the tension, and also it kind of helps to stop things getting tangled. Okay. So I'm just going to do the rest of this because you get the idea, and we'll just wind it on. Okay, we're pretty much wound on. Basically what you're doing is you're putting the cobble sticks in here, and it helps to keep the tension even as you wind it on. And you really want to stop when the warp gets to the front roller, which it more or less is. I might have wound it in a little bit too much, but that's okay. All right, the next step is we're going to cut this loop, okay, and then we need to alternately thread one of each pair. You see there's a pair through that slot. You're going to get one of each pair through this little nook here, which is really fun, but that goes quite quick. Okay, now take one thread from the first slot. There's going to be 2 threads in each slot. Using the threading hook, pull this thread through the eye to the right of the slot. The other thread stays in the slot. We're going to continue this across all of the slots. Okay, so what you want to do is get everything separated up. Make sure that you have all of your loops here. And what you can do is put your scissors through, and hopefully with the nice sharp fabric scissors, this will make a nice cut. Don't let it go, because you don't want it to go everywhere. Managed to splurge that a little bit, but right. Okay, cool. So theoretically everything's cut. If it's not, it doesn't matter. You just have to cut it when you get to it. Okay, the next step is we got a long slot and a short slot in the middle. So for each pair, what I want to do is basically go one to the left. It's easier if my threading hook is this way out. And I'm just going to pull one of these through, okay? So just get that on there and pull it through. You go through here and loop this guy around and just pull it through. There we go. Okay. Now you want to go slow on this because you don't want to get mixed up. So you're always going in the same direction, okay, depending on which end you start on, So you just pull one of these in, do the small slot, and just pull it through. And that's really all there is to it. So we're just going to do the whole thing here, and maybe the camera's going to run out before we get to the end. So I'm going to turn the camera off and just go thread all this, and we'll come back in a bit. So what we're trying to do here is we have one at the bottom of the slot, and then for the same pair we're going to come through the same slot in the middle. Once this is done, you can see that all the threads are in both eyes and slots. Okay, now we have each pair. One goes through this small hole in the heddle and the other goes through the large slot. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tie these into groups of about 8 and just tie a knot around them, and then we'll wind it onto the front roller. So just basically group 4 from the slots and 4 from underneath, and I'm just going to tie a simple overhand knot. Okay, try and make sure you get everything and pull this down so you got as much length as you can, really. Divide the threads into small groups of 8 or so and knot each group. I then take a long piece of string and loop through each knot and over and under the warp stick. I tie it off and once again ensure that the tension is even. Okay, so You push it down, you make a shed. So you go between the upper and the lower. But before we start weaving, what we want to do is wind on some scrap yarn. So I'm going to set up some scrap yarn. We'll get that going, and then we're pretty much done warping the loom. Winding on can be a little tricky. So at least when you're starting, try and make sure that you have someone to help you and keep an eye on your tension and alignment. You don't want the warp to become too loose or too tight, or to twist or cross over on itself. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just wind some scrap yarn onto this shuttle stick. And what we're trying to do here essentially is just get even spacing between everything, because you can sort of see it's all pulled in here. So the scrap yarn gets everything separated out, and then we can start actually weaving with what we want to weave with. Makes sense. Okay, so what I'm going to do is start on this side and just come through here. Okay, and I'm going to beat that down. Don't want to let that go, so I'm going to grab that back. Okay, so we'll just beat this to about here. Okay, and then come up here, go across. Alright, we're going to leave a little bit there. I'm going to pull this out a bit. Couple more, and then we'll be able to start our actual project. Alright, so thanks so much for joining us. Hope this is useful to you. If you like this content, please like, subscribe, do the thing, smash the button. It all helps. And see you next time. Your loom's now warped and ready for weaving. Once we've warped the loom, we can start weaving. So join us next time and we'll go through how to weave your scarf. Hope you enjoyed this. If you like this content, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for joining us.